Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling just a really complex and deeply disturbing case. It tells you a lot about the American justice system. We're talking about the Wichita Massacre from back in 2000. It was this week-long wave of terror that, it shocked everyone.
Absolutely. And what followed was this huge legal battle. We're talking, what, 2 decades?
Yeah.
It went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So in this deep dive, we're going to try and, synthesize the timeline of the crimes, look at those frustrating legal technicalities that kept the case bouncing around,
Right.
and also touch on the media coverage, because that became a whole thing, too.
It did. We've got sources that really paint a picture not just of the brutality, but the intense fear it created. December 2000 in Wichita, Kansas. Some locals even called it the Wichita Horror. It was just unprecedented for them.
And the perpetrators were identified as the Carr brothers. Reginald, who was 23, and Jonathan, only 20.
Yeah, they were basically drifters from Dodge City. Already had pretty significant criminal records before they even showed up in Wichita.
Their spree that week, it resulted in 5 people killed, 2 others severely wounded.
And the impact was immediate.
Yeah.
Intense. The randomness, the viciousness, it caused real panic. Our sources actually confirm, like, a measurable jump in people buying home security, new locks, even guns, right away.
It's important to see how it built up, though. It wasn't just one single explosion of violence. Let's maybe walk through the timeline leading up to the main event on the 14th.
Okay, yeah. So the spree kicked off December 8th, 2000. That's when they robbed and shot Andrew Schreiber. He was 23, an assistant baseball coach. He was wounded, but thankfully survived.
Okay, so that was a start. Then just 3 days later, December 11th, the violence really escalates.
It does. They target Ann Willenta. She was 55, a cellist and a librarian. She tried to get away in her car.
Oh, no.
And they shot her 3 times.
Oh, my gosh.
She was paralyzed instantly. She held on for a few weeks, but the injuries led to a pulmonary embolism, basically a severe blood clot. And she passed away January 2nd, 2001.
So even before the main incident, you already have 1 person murdered and another severely wounded from this spree.
Exactly. And then December 14th arrived. That night. This is where it just reaches this peak of horror. Sources say they picked a house on East Birchwood Drive completely at random. Just broke in.
And inside, there were 5 young people. Brad Haseka, he was a finance director. Heather Muller, a preschool teacher. Aaron Sander, who'd been a financial analyst but was studying for the priesthood.
Right. And Jason Bufford, a high school teacher, and his girlfriend, Holly G.
And it started as a robbery, but it seemed to twist into something else entirely, didn't it?
It absolutely did. While they were searching the house, they found an engagement ring. Jason Bufford had hidden it in a popcorn box. He was planning to propose to Holly G.
Wow.
And finding that ring, it seems like that's when it shifted from just taking stuff to this prolonged, calculated torture.
The details that emerged from that night they're almost unimaginable. The Carrs caused everyone to strip naked. They bound them. And then there was this long series of sexual assaults. They raped the women repeatedly, forced the men and women into sexual acts with each other. It's just horrific.
Utterly degrading and horrific. And after that, they didn't just leave. They used Befford's truck, forced all 5 victims into it, and drove them around to different ATMs.
Making them empty their bank accounts.
Yeah, forced them to withdraw everything.
Yeah.
Once they had the money, they drove them out of town to the Stryker soccer complex, which was deserted at that time of night.
And that's where the execution happened.
That's right. They forced all 5 to kneel down, shot each one execution style in the back of the head.
And then, as if that wasn't enough,
they drove the truck over the bodies. Just drove over them and left them there in the freezing cold. It's just devastating. But amidst all that horror, there was this one almost unbelievable moment of survival.
Right. Holly G., one of the women. She survived the shot to the head.
Incredible, isn't it? Sources say she had a plastic barrette in her hair. Apparently, it deflected the bullet just enough. It grazed her head instead of being fatal.
And the sheer will, the determination. After they left, she managed to get up. Naked, bleeding, severely injured, and walked over a mile in the freezing cold.
Just staggering.
Until she found a house, a couple took her in. Her testimony right then and there was absolutely vital. The description she gave led directly to the Carr's capture.
Absolutely crucial. And, we have to mention the lasting trauma.
Yeah.
The source material confirmed she contracted an STD from one of the Carrs during the assaults that night. It's just another layer of the violation.
And the cruelty just didn't stop. Even a truly devastating end to that night. So moving to the aftermath. Capture. conviction. It sounds like it happened relatively quickly.
It did, largely thanks to Holly G's incredibly detailed testimony, and also Andrew Schreiber. And before she died, Ann Walenta had also provided identifications pointing to Reginald Carr.
Okay.
So the brothers were eventually convicted on, almost everything. There were 113 counts total. Things like 4 counts of capital murder, first-degree murder for Ann Walenta, kidnapping, robbery, rape.
So Reginald was convicted on 50 counts, Jonathan on 43, and they were sentenced to death in October 2002.
Right. At that point, guilt wasn't really in question. The evidence was overwhelming. The death penalty seems like a certainty.
But, and this is a big but, this is where the American legal system, steps in and turns what seems like a closed case into this marathon, a 15-year legal roller coaster.
Exactly. The next decade plus, this case basically became the poster child, the central fight over the Kansas death penalty itself.
And what's so striking, looking at the sources, is how the fight wasn't about if they did it, but how the legal process worked. All procedure.
Precisely. It started in 2004. The Kansas Supreme Court actually overturned the entire state death penalty law. But then the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in, reversed the Kansas court, and said, no, the law is constitutional. Sentences reinstated.
So back on death row.
For a while. But the defense lawyers kept digging, and they found this key procedural issue. So in 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the death sentences again.
Okay, and this is the really technical bit we need to unpack for, for anyone listening. The core issue was the judge didn't give each brother a separate penalty hearing.
That sounds maybe minor, right? But in capital cases, it's huge. When the jury decides guilt, okay, they can look at the defendants together if they acted together.
Right.
But then when you get to the penalty phase, the life or death decision, the law demands it be super individualized.
Okay, help me understand why, though. They committed the crimes together. Why can't the jury decide their punishment together?
Because the jury has to weigh what the court calls the differentiation in the moral culpability. The death penalty can't be applied to a group. It has to be about the individual. Imagine maybe one brother was the clear ringleader, the other more of a follower, maybe less involved in certain acts, or maybe showed some remorse the other didn't.
Ah, okay.
If the jury has to sentence them as one unit, they can't give mercy to the potentially less culpable one without also giving it to the leader. They lose the ability to fine-tune the punishment based on individual factors.
I see. So hearing the penalty arguments together essentially forced the jury to view them as equally deserving of death. It blocked that individualized assessment of background, remorse, exact role.
That's exactly the argument. That joint penalty hearing prevented the necessary individualized consideration, and the Kansas Supreme Court agreed. That's why they vacated the sentences.
Oh.
You can imagine how devastating that was for the victims' families.
Absolutely. A solid conviction derailed because of how the penalty phase was structured.
Right. And even without the death penalty, these guys were looking at 70, 80 years minimum before parole. But the state's attorney general really pushed to keep the death sentences on the table.
Which leads us to the final stop, legally speaking. January 2016, the state took it back to the U.S. Supreme Court.
They did. And they won decisively, an 8-1 ruling. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned the Kansas decision. They reinstated the death sentences.
And what was their reasoning?
They basically said, look, neither the jury instructions they were given nor the fact that the sentencing was combined violated the U.S. Constitution. They felt the Kansas court had set too high a procedural bar in this specific instance.
So after all that back and forth, almost 20 years, the original sentences were back in place.
Yep. And just to close the loop, the Kansas Supreme Court formally affirmed those death sentences again on January 21st, 2022. So they are currently on death row.
And during all these appeals, any indication of their behavior?
Well, we have records from around 2014. They showed Jonathan Carr had racked up 23 disciplinary violations in prison. Reginald had 11. Give you some sense.
It's really a stark example of how the system prioritizes procedural integrity, sometimes over emotional resolution, ensuring due process even for the most condemned criminals, no matter how long it takes.
It absolutely is.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit, because there's this whole other dimension to the story, how the media and the public processed these horrific events. It got very political very quickly.
It really did. The racial dynamic was unavoidable. The victims were all white. The Carr brothers are black. Yeah. Now, the district attorney, Nola Falston, was clear from the start. She did not treat these as hate crimes. She maintained the motive was robbery, primarily financial.
But that didn't stop the narrative from growing way beyond Wichita, did it?
Not at all. You had conservative commentators, names like David Horowitz, Michelle Malk, and Thomas Sowell. They really latched onto this case.
And their argument was?
Their argument was that the national media was deliberately downplaying or even suppressing the story.
Why?
They claimed it was due to political correctness. So, well, for instance, argued there was a clear double standard. He said, look, when white perpetrators target black victims, it gets wall-to-wall national coverage. But when black perpetrators commit equally heinous crimes against white victims, major news outlets often mute it or bury it. That was their claim.
Okay, so that's the critique. And what makes that argument particularly interesting, or at least worth examining, is something the local paper, the Wichita Eagle, pointed out, right? There was another horrible crime right around the same time.
Yes, exactly. The Eagle drew a direct comparison to another quadruple murder that happened in Wichita just 8 days before the Carr brothers' main attack.
And what were the details there?
That was the case of Cornelius Oliver. He was a young black man. He murdered 4 young black individuals: his girlfriend, Rashonda Wheaton, her roommate Dessa Ford, and 2 of their friends, Jermaine Levy and Quincy Williams. Oliver shot the men execution style as they sat on a couch.
So 4 people killed. Execution style. Horrific. But the coverage?
Vastly different. The Oliver case got some local attention, of course, but nationally, almost nothing compared to the Carr case, which became this recurring national story for years with every appeal.
And one of the victims' relatives in the Oliver case actually asked the media directly, didn't she? Something like.
Yeah, a relative of Rashonda Wheaton basically asked, how could one be any worse than the other if the results, multiple deaths, were the same? It's a really powerful question.
It is. So if the death toll was similar, why did the Carr case capture the national spotlight in a way the Oliver case didn't? What are the key distinctions our sources highlight?
There seem to be 2 major factors that influence the perception of, well, viciousness and newsworthiness. First, the relationship aspect. Oliver knew his victims. It was tragically categorized in media terms as personal or domestic-related violence, even though friends were also killed.
Okay, whereas the Carrs?
The Carrs chose their victims randomly. That taps into a much broader societal fear, doesn't it? The idea that anyone could be next. It feels like an attack on the whole community, not just specific individuals.
Right. The randomness definitely elevates the fear factor. And the second distinction, it seems pretty crucial.
It's almost certainly the deciding factor. The method, the torture, and the abuse.
The prolonged nature of it.
Exactly. The Carr case involved hours of torture. The stripping, the binding, the repeated rapes, the forced sexual acts, the degradation, before the execution-style killings. The Oliver case, while utterly brutal, was primarily a shooting.
So that added layer of sexual violence, prolonged suffering, and random targeting, that's what really pushed the Carr case beyond local news and made it a sustained national story regardless of any political framing about race.
That seems to be the key takeaway from analyzing the coverage disparity. It was the specific nature of the cruelty, especially the sexual violence and the random selection, that resonated nationally.
And just for context, Cornelius Oliver, he's serving a life sentence, right? No parole possibility until something like the year 2140.
That's correct. So ultimately, what the source material seems to show is that our perception of how vicious a crime is often defined by that random malice, and the addition of sexual torture heavily influences not just the legal charges, like capital murder versus other charges, but also how much national attention it gets and for how long.
So wrapping this deep dive up, what are the big takeaways? Legally, it's incredibly clear how procedural details, like that whole debate over separate penalty hearings, can keep a case that seems definitive in terms of guilt just stuck in legal limbo for decades. Process over resolution sometimes.
Definitely. And it's also vital we remember the victims. Beyond the legal wrangling, memorials exist, thankfully. There's the Heather Muller Love of Faith Award at St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic School, where she taught.
Right.
And the Anne Valenta Music Scholarship and Fellowship at Wichita State University, honoring her legacy as a musician.
It's good those exist. So the synthesis really shows this tension, doesn't it? The sheer horror of the crime demands justice now, but the legal system demands this painstaking precision, which then fuels years, even decades, of appeals and uncertainty.
It does. And maybe here's a final thought for you to consider. When you see how the media covers different tragedies, think about those elements. Random terror, sexual violence. Are those often the filters that determine if a story becomes a brief local headline or a national obsession? Does the how and the why of a crime often end up shaping public memory even more than the tragic what the number of lives lost.
That's a really essential, though difficult distinction to keep in mind when you reflect on the terrible details and the very complex aftermath of the Wichita Massacre. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.